Hello and welcome to episode 89 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm May.
Welcome back all. I want your advice on something. My off-site backup situation is not ideal. I've got a NUC with a USB hard drive and I want to improve that situation. I've got the disks under control, that's fine. And they would ideally be SATA in whatever I replace that NUC with, or there could be USB in theory, but I'd rather go SATA. But the question is, what should I get? Because I've got this NUC doing nothing. I've got the Ys that I could use. I've got bricks. I've got too many computers. So I'd ideally not like to buy anything, but I think I'm probably going to have to buy something. But I just don't know what. Like, do I buy an old, 5th or 6th gen Intel small-ish desktop that's got a couple of SATA ports on it? Or do I go for something modern? I just don't know. So what would you do for something that's going to have 2 disks in it and an SSD, and that is fairly cheap to buy, doesn't use a lot of juice, doesn't take up too much space in the other person's house?
Can we just back up from the problem you're trying to solve? What is it about the current setup that is actually causing a problem for your offsite backup? Obviously USB not ideal, but you're just writing backups over whatever crappy upload you've got at home, right? It's not performance limited. Stability presumably is fine unless someone bumps the drive. What are you trying to solve for?
I want to add a second disk, and I could do that just via USB, but I just feel like I want to do this properly.
So I've had this dilemma bubbling for ages because, as we've covered on the show a while ago, my main NAS is a Lenovo consumer desktop PC with 2 SATA ports, and I've wedged in a Supermicro cage for an extra 3.5 bay. So the both disks are properly SATA, and then the OS runs from a NVMe to PCIe adapter. So everything is not USB. But the secondary box I have is one of those little 1 litre Optiplex machines, which has an NVMe and a SATA connector, and it has a 2 terabyte, 2.5 inch laptop drive with a single drive ZFS pool on it. Most of the stuff on there is ephemeral, actually. So I take snapshots to it, and then I also back up to Borg, but I'm not super happy with it. And you could get a big NVMe drive and a big SATA SSD and make a 2-drive mirror, but it would be as slow as the SATA link. So I have thought about doing that. But then there are also boxes like that where you can fit 2 drives in, but it has to be both NVMe, or you can put a riser card in with NVMe. And my problem is dropping Rust because the price per gigabyte starts to become expensive. And also, it's not the main box. I don't want to spend the money on flash storage for something that's ultimately mostly backups and read-only content.
And unfortunately, there's really no one who's doing a really good NAS case that isn't supposed to be a NAS. There isn't anyone doing a bare bones NAS at this point.
Yeah, that was going to be my other question, Joe, is what kind of size do you want? Because there's plenty of ITX, cube size cases out there, like the size of a shuttle PC that you could get 6 disks in. But that maybe feels a bit too big to stick in someone's living room.
Yeah, I don't know how important size is, really. I think that power consumption is my main concern, really, because I just don't want to take the piss with someone else's electricity.
We looked, didn't we, once, Gary? I think you sent the link. There was an N100-based NAS with 2 proper SATA ports in a kind of vertical NAS form factor, but it was dropshipped from AliExpress. And there's a big gap in the market, I think, for a name that you would trust to have a good hardware bill of materials and a good warranty backup to muscle in there and create something of the form factor that matches a Synology. But I think, May, you're right. It's just not out there, really.
Well, I think that product does exist, and I've just pasted it into our chat, and it's from a company called TerraMaster.
Ah, yes.
Who have been around making these kind of pre-built bare-bones NAS with their own OS for ages. But the thing they allow you to do is it's just a standard Intel box underneath, and you can install your own OS. So I've seen plenty of YouTube videos of people putting Proxmox on these, for example, and just making a really low-powered virtualization host. However, the flip side is it's 300 quid for something that's the spec of a Wise 5070, but it does have 2.5 gig Ethernet.
That's it. It's a Celeron, a weak Celeron, which fulfills Joe's power draw, but you just feel like you're being kicked in the guts to pay that much money for it.
Yeah, if it was 100 quid, I'd just get it. But I'm not paying 300 for that.
Yeah.
It's got 2.5 gigabit Ethernet interfaces.
Yeah, which it can definitely saturate with those Intel CPUs.
Hey, we shouldn't be doing an advertisement for these guys. We should ask them for that.
Yeah.
Well, you feel like if they replace that with an N100, then you're talking about, you might think about paying a bit more because it would have the performance at the low power draw plus 2 3.5-inch bays, 2 NVMe slots, and it could be your main NAS. But yeah, that's a weird spec.
It is a strange spec, but I think that they basically got the game cornered. Like, there's a lot of other manufacturers making those mini NVMe NAS, but like you say, the price per gigabyte just doesn't stack up. This seems to be the only reasonable solution with 2.5-inch, an NVMe slot, and low power draw.
Right. It's worth saying that there are a lot of those, Raspberry Pi things or things that you can put a Raspberry Pi or some other single board computer in, or it's got an ARM board already in there, but that's just going to be way too much work.
Especially with ZFS. I had a friend that had an Odroid, one of those, and it's just painful compared to being able to install x86 Ubuntu proper and get everything you need.
Yeah, the software support's going to go away in a couple of years. It's just, it's not a good situation.
So what about like a 4th, 5th, 6th generation i3 or something?
Well, the problem you've then got is it's full-size PC, right? To get the disks you need, it's going to be a micro ATX PC sitting somewhere in someone's living room, which isn't really much nicer at all, is it?
And also, I've been down this rabbit hole as well before, where you're better off getting a 7th or 8th gen because you get more efficient usage of power then. But then even the small form factor ones went from 2 3.5-inch bays to 1 to make it more compact. So you end up, like Gary said, you end up buying the micro tower form factor at the bare minimum just to fit 2 disks in. Or you do what I did, you buy the 1 bay one and then find a void in the case to fit a 3.5-inch drive. Now, I could do that because it uses a laptop PSU. So there's a void. They use the same case for my one for more powerful processors that need an actual power supply in the case. So there's just a void where a usual ATX power supply would be, and that's where my extra drive is wedged in a super micro rack. But honestly, this is not as easy to answer as you think. And whilst you can get away with USB, as we explored in the Janky NAS challenge, it's not great. And also, I would feel much more confident dropping off a single sealed unit with proper SATA ports at a friend's house and just say, just put it in a corner, don't worry about it, than the dangling tail of USB hanging about.
Yeah. 1 box, 2 cables, network, power, job done.
Exactly.
Now, I would say that size is the least important factor here. I think that if anything's going to give, like even if it has to be a proper full-size PC case, that'll do.
Well, in which case then, I would say you want to be looking at 8th gen EliteDesk 800 series HPs because they have 2 drive bays in a small form factor. So it's very compact, but they have 2 3.5-inch bays and an NVMe slot for your OS. And then you're done. And it's still about the size of an old VHS.
Has it got a proprietary power supply though?
It does, but why is that worrying?
Because when it goes, I'll just be completely knackered trying to replace it. Whereas if I can just put a standard power supply in it, if that goes, it's easy to, I can just go drive over there, swap it out, get it back up and running again.
I guess then you come back to custom build some kind of mini ITX in a shuttle size case solution, don't you?
Yeah.
Like get an N100 board or something like that. Standard PSU, you can fit 4 drives in there. Most of the N100 boards have an NVMe slot on for boot, but the power consumption isn't amazing on those either.
Right, and I was looking at an Asus one, Asus, whatever you want to say, and it looked absolutely brilliant. But it had one SATA port on it. Why on earth they didn't put two, I have no idea.
Would you not think about doing the shuffle? So moving your main NAS now to being the one that you back up to and replacing it with something that is your main NAS?
Well, my main NAS is also my TV box.
Ooh.
It is 9600K with, I think, like 16 gigs of RAM or something. It's massive overkill for being a NAS, but it's what's plugged into the TV. And these are just like main entertainment machine.
Ah, so you don't have the Celeron J box anymore?
I do have that, and I want to have that as my local backup.
Right, I see. So you want a NAS, a local backup, and an offsite backup.
Yeah. And I just don't want any of them to be USB.
And you want it to be a standard replaceable, non-proprietary power supply.
Ideally.
Yeah, so I think you're better off finding, even if it's second-hand but in good condition, find the case, get yourself an N100 board, and then kit it out.
The problem with that is there's not that much choice, really, in the way of N100 boards. A lot of them seem to only have one SATA port like that ASUS one.
Yeah, so I had this problem when I built my NAS, which I no longer use as a NAS, long story, around one of those ASUS N100 boards, and ended up getting an M.2 SATA controller with 5 SATA ports on to solve this problem. Again, you're never going to get decent performance out of it.
But it's an offsite backup, I don't care.
Yeah, it's an offsite backup, so you don't care.
And once it's assembled, it's still a single unit, and those adapters are fairly solid because you're just breaking out PCI pins. So we can't give you an answer, Joe, basically. We can give you other questions.
Well, for my money, I would probably go with something like the N100 ITX build that I did, because that very much seems to meet the requirements you wanted. Small, low-ish power, expansion room for plenty of drives, proper SATA, normal ATX power supply. But it's going to cost you 120 quid for the board, probably another 80 quid for a decent case, probably that again for a decent power supply. So by the time you've done that, you're probably in it for almost as much as one of those TerraMasters. And the only thing you're getting is an N100 rather than the measly Celeron.
And you could, if you drop this power supply requirement, be getting a decent 8th gen used Optiplex or HP one that could do everything, and it would be like 50 quid.
I like the sound of 50 quid, I must say. So you think I should just get on eBay and get one of them then?
You'd have to hawk around a bit because the ones that have been on there for a while, yeah, but if you don't mind about size, then the micro tower form factor will almost always have 2 drive bays in it, and it's like a sort of mini ATX sized desktop. But the 8300, 8400, 8500 i5s are in loads of those, and obviously they're end of life, end of lease, so they get sold in bulk all the time, and you can spec them out with secondhand RAM and stuff like that. So if you go on places like Data Hoarder on Reddit, the subreddits, that's the sort of thing that people get recommended a lot.
And here at Linux After Dark, we do like reducing e-waste.
Yeah, exactly. You're saving the planet as well. Because as I said, like once you get to 8th gen, it's mostly going to be idling, and they idle quite well, actually, at quite low power draw. They're capable of quite good grunt, but that doesn't mean that it has to be running at that all the time.
Right. I think I know what I'm going to do then. I'm going to scour eBay for an 8th gen box with room for 2 drives in it.
I think if the power supply goes, then you'll just have to get another one. And there's so many of these around that you should be able to find another one. The problem is, as time goes on, they're all secondhand. That is a fair concern.
Yeah, but I can just take the discs out, can't I? As long as they don't get fried by the dying power supply.
Yeah, this is true.
Yeah, I mean, you could buy a whole new machine for the cost of going and buying a decent ATX power supply.
Right, I think that's what I'm going to do then. Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxafterdark.net/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at linuxafterdark.net/support. Let's do some feedback then. Rhett writes, I noticed on episode 86 that every one of the hosts seems to have an extensive knowledge on terms related to XFCE, Wayland, and Mate. How does one hone into the schematics of window managers and desktops? I started Linux in 2014 as an unemployed, service-connected, disabled veteran out in the States. I knew Army terms and way of life, and I started day zero with Linux as a noob with no school or professional experience. My quest has led me 10 years later to be a sysadmin. What advice do you have for an admin who has little experience with thin provisioning?
To answer the first bit, for me personally, I wouldn't have spoken about that so much if it wasn't for my job. So we have been working for the last year, because we have a high-performance computing cluster, it really should be used headless for scripted workloads. But of course, this is 2025. Most people want a graphical user interface. And so they want Jupyter notebooks or they want RStudio. They don't want to run a Python script or R, just as, you know, the R shell or R script and run headless workloads. So we have to find a balance. And so one of the things we've had to do is try to make those run in a web browser via VNC on very much headless machines with high specifications. And that's quite challenging to do, especially if you want CUDA accelerated machine learning workloads. So the last year for me has been exploding the XFCE desktop and dbus to make things work in that environment. So prior to that, I don't think have had such a low level knowledge. So it's really just experience that has led me to that. And based on top of that, I developed an interest in LabWC, which I think I also talked about in that episode, just because I'm interested in Wayland and how it all fits together. But May, you must know some of this stuff from UBport's days, right?
Sure. I think that ultimately it's just a matter of break it and try and fix it again. For me, the best way for me to learn something is to get in and do it, whatever it is. So I used to use Mate on the desktop, so I understand a bit of what people are talking about when they talk about different components of that desktop, because I needed to fix them sometimes, because they would break or not come together or not start with the rest of the operating system for some reason. Also, congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, very much so. It sounds like you worked very hard to become a sysadmin. And I think it's just a very different thing. Like there's just two worlds in Linux. There's the sort of professional sysadmin, servery, headless type of Linux. And then there's the desktop. And yeah, there's a lot of overlap between people who use the desktop and people who use it on servers, but not necessarily. There's a lot of people who use Macs or Windows to administer these Linux servers. And the Linux desktop is very niche, is the bottom line.
And that's a really good point that May made, is essentially fuck around and find out. Like the last year, one of the things we really wanted to get, quite a lot of people that use our system want to render things in 3D and manipulate them with the mouse, whether that's molecular structures or medical imaging. And I just kept chipping away, monitoring the GPU and using this thing called Virtual GL, which is a bit old hat now because everyone uses Vulkan. But a lot of these applications are old hat. Development is slow in scientific software. But yeah, you just keep throwing things at the wall, which you can do with things like containers, as we've discussed before, and looking for a breakthrough. And now, after a year, we're starting to see the fruition of that, where people are using them and saying, wow, this is so much better. It's like, yeah, because it's accelerated on the graphics card, but it was a pain in the ass to get there. And they're never going to care because they log into a web portal, they load the application, and it just works, in inverted commas. They don't care that it's an exploded container manipulating dbus to run through VNC. They care that they can move their graphical image around and it doesn't lag and it's in incredibly high detail.
The scourge of IT. When things are working, why do we even have you?
Yes.
I would say that if you want to get into the Linux desktop, just get hold of an old ThinkPad. Get some other machine that you can dedicate to it and break stuff. And if you've got sysadmin experience, you'll have a fair idea which logs to look at and how to analyze them when things break. And before you know it, you'll just learn stuff just by doing it.
Also, the Arch Wiki. I cannot tell you, the last year, when you're struggling with these weird esoteric quirks, it's so well documented for all the different desktop environments and all the different stacks and layers and connectors. And so, yeah, as we've said many a time before, even if you don't run Arch, it's such a treasure trove of not just reference directly, but reference links that help you to understand. And we use the Arch Wiki for Virtual GL to finally make me realize where all of the display servers were and what was going down the tunnel and what wasn't in different configurations, because they've graphically mapped it out. And that's the same for all the different technologies of the desktop. So definitely worth bookmarking that.
Also, very important, if you are trying to break things and figure out how to fix them, apt install -- reinstall might fix it, but you don't know why. It's best to actually dig down until you get to a root cause, and then, yeah, absolutely, the fix is probably just apt install -- reinstall, but then you know why that fixes it.
But like I say, don't do it on your main machine.
Although, if you do it by accident, that's how you learn. If you've got work to do.
That's true. But yeah, maybe there is an argument for just daily drive it, just have no alternative, and then you'll have to learn to fix it. But now that Windows 10 is due to not get any more updates in a few months, your sort of 6th and 7th gen Intel ThinkPads are dirt cheap, and they will run Linux like a champ still. So you could do a lot worse than get hold of one of them and just tinker with it. Well, we'd better wrap it up then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
And I've been May.
See you later.